Hey, folks, it's time to go back to the drawing board. I'm Nate, and I'm here tonight to talk about villains. Specifically, the tragic villain. Tragic villains are an archetype I don't think we see that much in comics these days. Let's start by establishing what I mean by a tragic villain. A tragic villain is a character who turns to evil not so much because his personality is inherently flawed. Well, possibly because his personality is inherently flawed. Regardless, he turns to evil because the part of him that kept him away from evil, that motivated him to stay on the straight and narrow, is lost. A great example of the tragic villain in comics is Magneto. His experience in the concentration camps in the Second World War took away his innocence, so to speak. And when he awoke to his mutant powers, he saw them as another persecuted minority, and he was willing to go to any means necessary to defend them. Magneto is a villainous character. He does a lot of evil things, but it's very easy to understand why he does those things. And Magneto is a very popular villain. He's probably one of the strongest that Marvel has to offer from a character writing standpoint. Obviously, there are villains who are more powerful than he is in the Marvel universe. But Magneto is very strong. He's very popular. He seems to be a perennial favorite with X-Men fans. And he's not the only example of this. If we look at the MCU, there are three great tragic villains. In fact, I would say that the three best villains in the MCU are considered to be Loki, Eric Killmonger, and Thanos, all of whom are fairly tragic villains. Loki, of course, he never had anything to counteract the worst parts of his personality, but he was always seeking the affection of his father, and he always felt that it was perhaps unfairly settled on Thor rather than on him. Now, admittedly, there's a bit of a hubris in that, I suppose, but it's still very easy to understand where Loki's animosity came from. Killmonger, of course, was heavily influenced by the murder of his father when he was a young boy. And again, he may have become a genocidal zealot later in life, but it's very easy to understand where his antipathy towards the people of Wakanda and the people of the world in general came from. They murdered his father, and he had to live. He had to grow up without him. That's a very hard thing to carry, and it could very easily turn a person into a villain. Thanos, of course, is a bit different. The collapse of Titan, we don't know exactly what that meant for him personally, but a disaster on the scale of a planetary destruction, I mean, that has to unhinge a person. So it's very easy to understand why he would adopt such a hard-line stance on his admittedly silly policy of wiping out half the universe. He had seen such a horrible thing happen, and he didn't want it to happen again, so he did whatever he thought he had to do. But I think actually the best tragic villain of the last few years is actually found on Netflix in their take on Castlevania. Dracula in that is another tragic villain. In his case, the thing that kept him on the straight and narrow was his wife Lisa, and when she's murdered, he becomes the same time suicidal and genocidal. That's a pretty neat trick. And his desire to wipe out humanity was fueled by his grief at their murder of his wife. That's a very, very simple, easy to understand motivation that doesn't decrease how monstrous he is, but makes it very easy to see how he is also human. And that's what makes these villains so powerful. They remind us of ourselves, because we see the tragedy they struggle with, and it then in turn reminds us of the things we struggle with that could drive us to evil, because we all struggle with an impulse towards evil. It's not a thing that is common fodder for comic books. They tend to draw pretty clear lines between good and evil, and that's fine. I mean, if that's part of your narrative conceit, go ahead and go all out into it. But the tragic villain, by giving us that reminder of ourselves, is a much stronger, bolder characterization than, say, something like the Chitauri from the MCU that just seem like mindless foot soldiers, or even the Joker as he is portrayed most of the time in Batman comics, just sort of a psychopath. You can't really find much of yourself in a character like that. The Joker is interesting, of course, and he can be compelling, and there's nothing wrong with that kind of a villain. So by no means hear me saying that the Joker is a bad kind of a villain, or that a tragic villain is in some way inherently better than other kinds of villains. But there is a very compelling and personal aspect to these villains that other kinds of villains rarely have. And your story may not call for a compelling villain of that kind, but I'm just saying that we don't seem to see these kinds of tragic villains in comics very much right now, and that's a shame. They not only are they powerful and compelling, they're also very complex. There's many different facets of them you can explore. For your example, take Magneto. You can explore the part of him that wants world conquest, and you can explore the part of him that wants. Actually, I don't think he doesn't really want world conquest so much as he wants to establish his own state for mutants. So you can explore that. You can explore the part of him that is emotionally scarred by his time in the prison camps. You can go back in time and examine that part of his life. You can relate that to modern events, and you can have him acting on his empathy towards people who are persecuted, even if his empathy drives him to do evil things. You can explore the part of him that is, well, let's see. You can explore the part of him that's interested in being a mutant itself. There's very many different ways you could go that give you different kinds of stories to tell. Is what I'm trying to say. You don't have to tell the same story every time. One of my problems with the Joker is that he tends to be shown as driven primarily by his I don't know if animosity is the right word, but his antagonism towards Batman, let's say that. He doesn't have very many personal goals that seem to go outside of Batman. By the same token, a villain like Black Manta is driven by his desire to be ruler of the seas, or to supplant Aquaman in some way. So there's not as many aspects of the character. And I'm not an expert on either Joker or Black Manta. So I admittedly have a less deep understanding of both of those characters, but I'm not really an expert on Magneto either. Um, so I can see, even from a very casual perspective, that it looks like there is more story potential behind a character like Magneto than there is behind a character like Black Manta or the Joker. Um, so I think there's something to be said just from a storyteller's perspective for these tragic villains, because they give you so many other different knobs you can turn. You can fit them into more stories because they have a little more complexity in their basic concept. And lastly, I think tragic villains are important because they reaffirm the humanity of evil. And that's not something that we like to think about, maybe. And maybe, a lot of comic books don't want to delve too deeply into that. But at a time where we have people who don't want to show any kind of sympathy or empathy to their political opponents when something happens to them, when they laugh about seeing, a car with a I voted Make America Great Again bumper sticker, and they laugh about leaving it stranded in the snow. At times like that, times like this, where there is so much animosity between different groups of people, the tragic villain can really tell stories that remind us that even if we think there are people out there who are evil, or who are at least doing evil things, they still may have very strong, relatable, personal reasons for those evil decisions, or decisions that you see as evil, at least. And you can still relate to them as a fellow human being. There can still be sympathy and empathy and even compassion for those people, without conceding to them that the things that you see in them that are evil are not evil. And when you look at it from that perspective, maybe it's not surprising that these tragic villains are less common in comics right now, when you have the it's a Nazi brigade out there, doxing people and laughing at every little misfortune that they might have. Maybe it's not surprising that they can't write these tragic villains. But it's sad. It's sad because their stories were great, and they're lost to us now. And I think mainstream comics is poor for the absence of these tragic villains. So maybe if you're out there in the indies, working on your own comic like I am, you can think a little bit about how you might incorporate one of these more complex, more tragic villains. Just something to think about. Anyway, that's all I got to say for tonight. Signing out.